Dana Harris's Introduction to Biblical Greek Grammar, Chapter 14, etc. is more on adjectives, verbs, and adverbs. Objectives and overview. Chapter 14 develops some previously introduced concepts or forms and presents a few new concepts. The main focus of this chapter, however, is on integrating what you have learned from chapters 9 and 13. Chapter 14 covers the following linguistic concepts, morphemes, and paradigms. Irregular adjectives, megas, megale, mega, and polus, pole, and polu. Comparatives and superlatives, verbs that take a direct object in a case other than the accusative, passive deponents, basic adverb formation, summary of dependent clauses. Irregular adjectives. So far, we have learned the various patterns that adjectives follow, such as 212, 22, 313, and 33 declension patterns. There are some adjectives that follow these patterns, but which have certain irregularities in their paradigms. Consider the two adjective paradigms found on the opposite page. Based on what you have seen so far, you would not expect to find a mix between primarily second and some third declension endings in the masculine and neuter forms for these two adjectives. The feminine form, however, follows the A-type pattern for the first declension feminine nouns exactly. In both of the paradigms, the nominative and accusative singular for both the masculine and neuter forms underlined play by third declension rules and have a shortened version of the stem than is used in the rest of the paradigm, namely mega and pol. The remaining masculine and neuter forms then play by second declension rules using the longer version of the adjective stem, namely megal and pol. So megas, megale, mega. Nominative singular, megas, megale, mega. Genitive singular, megalou, megales, megalou. Dative singular, megalo, megale, megalo. Accusative singular, megan, megalane, mega. Nominative plural, megaloi, megalai, megala. Genitive plural, megalone, megalone, megalone. Dative plural, megalois, megalais, megalois. Accusative plural, megalus, megalas, megala. Paulus, pole, paulu. Nominative singular, paulus, pale, pole, paulu. Genitive singular, paulu, paules, paulu. Dative singular, paulo, paule, paulo. Accusative singular, paulun, paulane, paulu. Nominative plural, poloi, polai, pola. Genitive plural, polon, polon, polon. Dative plural, polois, polais, polois. Accusative plural, polus, polas, pola. Sometimes students get forms from polus, pole, polu confused with the noun polis. Here are some tips for keeping these two words straight. First, polis never has two lambdas. So if you can count to two and count two lambdas in a form that begins with pol, then you know that it must be from polus, pole, polu. Second, there is no epsilon in any form of the polis paradigm. So if you see a single lambda followed by an epsilon, then you must also have a form of polus, pole, polu. You do not need to memorize these paradigms, but you should be familiar with how to recognize them as they occur frequently in the Greek New Testament. Polus, pole, polu is very common in the Greek New Testament, especially its substantival use. Here are a few examples. Kai etherapusen polus kai demonia pola exebelan. He healed many people and he cast out many demons. Kai exelpheon eden polun oklon. And exiting, he saw a great crowd. Mark 134 provides a good example of polus, pole, polu, functioning both substantively, polus with people, restored from the context in the first part of the verse, and attributively, pola modifying daimonia in the second part of the verse. Comparatives and superlatives. Some adjectives indicate a positive, e.g. agathos, good, or negative, e.g. kakos, bad, quality or attribute. A comparative shows the degree of that quality between two entities, e.g. better or worse. And a superlative shows the degree of that quality between more than two entities, e.g. best or worst. An elative describes intensification of a quality, e.g. very good or very bad. In English, comparative adjectives are often formed by adding er to an adjective, and superlative adjectives are often formed by adding est. For example, holy, adjective, holier, comparative, holiest, superlative. In Greek, the ending teros, tera, teron, 212, is often added to an adjective form to indicate a comparative. Tatos, tate, taton, 212 is often added to an adjective form to indicate a superlative. For example, mikros, small, adjective. Mikroteros, smaller, comparative. Mikrotatos, smallest, superlative. By the time of the NT, however, positives and negatives were taking over the duties of comparatives and superlatives. Thus, sometimes a positive or negative is used in the Greek New Testament when a comparative or even a superlative is expected. For example, protos, first, and eschatos, last, are not actually superlative forms, even though they are often used with this meaning in the Greek New Testament. Instead, they are ordinals, if you're curious. There are also comparative and superlative adverbs. These are frequently found in the accusative singular neuter form of the comparative or superlative adjective. For example, escuteros, escuroteron is a comparative adverb, more strongly, struggled with that one. And escurotata is a superlative adverb, most strongly, and both forms are derived from the accusative singular neuter form of the adjective iskoros, on, strong. You do not need to memorize any paradigms for comparatives and superlatives. If you memorize the endings, teros, tera, teron, 212, that are added to an adjective form to indicate a comparative, and tatos, tate, taton, 212 for the superlative, you will be able to recognize comparative and superlative adjectives and adverbs when you encounter them in the Greek New Testament. Verbs that take a direct object in a case other than the accusative. So far, we have seen the direct object of verbs in the accusative case, but there are some verbs that have direct objects in the genitive or dative cases. A good lexicon will specify in which case or cases a direct object occurs for a given verb, but here are some helpful guidelines. Verbs that involve the senses, such as hearing, touching, perceiving, holding, and remembering, often have a direct object in the genitive. Some common examples include the following: akuo, I hear; optomai, I touch; guomai, I taste; epithumeo, I desire; meno, ne moneo, I remember; ne moneu, I remember. Struggle with that one as well. The following verbs often have a direct object in the dative case. Some of these verbs involve speaking. Akalutheo, I follow; diakoneo, I serve; douleo, I serve. Imgizo, I draw near; epitimaho, I rebuke; martureo, I bear witness; pisto, I believe; proskuneo, I worship; upokeo, hope; upokuo, I obey. Not all these verbs have been in the assigned vocabulary yet, but the vocabulary lists in this book indicate the case that a verb takes for its direct object if it is not the accusative case. Passive deponents. We have already discussed the concept of deponency and the debate surrounding it, but the discussion has thus far only concerned the middle voice. Some verbs, however, have what is called a passive deponent, such as apokrythane and sunekthane. It is clear from the context in which these forms occur that a passive sense, e.g., I was answered or I was gathered together, is not intended. Moreover, in these contexts, there is no occurrence of hupo, indicating agency, which often occurs with passive verbs. Thus, the aorist passive in these instances indicates an intransitive, active sense of the verb. Consider the following examples. Kai apokrythe auto, Ace ectu oklu didaskale, Mark 9:17, and one from the crowd answered him, Teacher, sunek thesan oi archieres kai oi phariseoi pros Pilaton. The chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate. In both examples, clearly neither apokrythe nor sunek thesan reflect a passive voice. In the first example, the person in the crowd is answered Jesus, not being answered. Similarly, in the second example, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered themselves before Pilate, were not gathered together by some other agent. The reasons for this phenomenon are complex, but fortunately, both apokrynomai and sunago often occur in the passive with an active meaning. You will become so used to this that you won't think much about it. Basic adverb formation. In English, adverbs are often formed by adding the suffix ly to an adjective, as in quickly, or faithful plus ly, faithfully, and so on. Something similar occurs for adverbs in Greek that end with os. Greek adverbs begin with the genitive plural form of a Greek adjective. For example, the genitive plural form of the adjective kalos, on, good, is kalon. We remove the nu from the genitive plural and add a sigma. We have the adverb kalos, well. There are other types of adverbs in which the ending often indicates broadly the type of information that the adverb is supplying. Consider the following. Ote, time, pantote, pote, tote. Then, origin, pothen, often, and prosthen. O, location, ago, ano, exo, hopizo. U, location, u, opu, pu. Is, frequency, tris polakis. Again, this isn't something that you need to memorize, but it can be helpful information to refer to as you are working through texts in the GNT. Summary of dependent clauses introduced so far. The following is a summary of the different types of dependent clauses that we have seen in chapters 1 to 13. In the following examples, the subordinated conjunction is indicated with a gray background, and the dependent clause is in a parenthesis. Notice also that the dependent clause is aligned under the word that it modifies. Specifically, haughty clauses and adverbial participial clauses are aligned under the verb that they modify, underlined. And the relative clause is aligned under its antecedent, underlined. Notice also the parallel syntactic function of the haughty clause and the adverbial participial clause. Haughty clauses. Alla humes u pistuete, aute uc este ecton probaton ton emon. But you yourselves do not believe because you are not from my sheep. Adverbial participial clauses. Kai te rigen en hole te Galilea, didaskon entais synagogais, auton kai keruson to evangelion. And he went around the whole of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel. Relative clauses. Idu apostello ton angelon mu pro prosobu su, hos kataskuase en hodon su. See, I send my messenger before you who will prepare your way. It is always important to identify the boundaries of a dependent clause. This often involves identifying the subordinating conjunction and then identifying the boundary of the dependent clause that the conjunction introduces. Then you need to identify the word or words that the dependent clause is modifying. For participles, this first involves recognizing that the participle is adverbial, then identifying the boundaries of the participial clause, and finally identifying which finite verb the adverbial participle is modifying. For relative clauses, you begin by identifying the relative pronoun and the boundaries of the relative clause that it introduces. And identify the substantive that the relative clause modifies. By indenting the dependent clause under either the verb on which it depends or the antecedent, you can begin to see the syntax in the text. We will keep developing this in this book. That's the end of chapter 14. As you can tell, if you are a perfectionist when it comes to pronunciation, this channel is not for you. I'm in the process of changing my pronunciation system from Erasmian to modern, and my pronunciation is quite muddled. And as you could also hear, I mispronounced some English words while I was reading this. So my advice would be pronunciation does not need to be perfect, especially when you're going through a beginner course and textbook.